What's up, .NET developers? Do you have a .NET app today and you just want to get to the cloud as fast as possible? Maybe you have it in source code. Maybe you have a Docker container image. Well, in this video, we're going to go through setting up AWS App Runner, the quickest way to get your app to the cloud, right here on AWS for the .NET developer. Hey folks, Isaac Levin here with another edition of AWS for the .NET developer. And if you're liking the videos and the content that you're seeing here, be sure to like, subscribe, share them with your friends. And let me know if there's other stuff that you want to see, other sort of AWS specific content for .NET that you want to see. Because the goal here is to make the life of a .NET developer much simpler. So with that, let's talk a little bit about where we've been to or where we've gone to this point. So if you've been following along, we've talked a lot about container options that exist in AWS. So be sure to check out some of the videos if you haven't. These services, they range from going from Elastic Container Services and Elastic Kubernetes Services to Fargate, moving farther and farther away from the management of the underlying infrastructure our containers run. And even if you want to get even farther away from the management of your containerized applications in AWS, there's AWS App Runner. AWS App Runner is a fully managed service that makes it easy for developers to quickly deploy containerized web applications and APIs at scale with no prior infrastructure experience required. Start with your source code or a container image. App Runner builds and deploys the web application automatically. Load balances traffic with encryption, scales to meet your traffic needs, makes it easy for your services to communicate with other AWS services and applications that run in a private Amazon VPC. With App Runner, rather than thinking about servers or scaling, you have more time to focus on your applications. When you connect App Runner to your code repository or container image registry, App Runner can automatically build and deploy your application when you update your source code or container image. App Runner also provides features like load balancing, autoscaling, and HTTPS to include by default, so no need to spend additional cycles configuring this functionality. It's just there, ready to be used. App Runner makes it easy to monitor and optimize your containerized applications by providing detailed build, deployment, and runtime logs. You can also get a full set of compute metrics with built-in Amazon CloudWatch integration. To get started with App Runner, let's just point it at a GitHub repository or an Elastic Container Registry image, like I mentioned earlier, and the framework will then do all the necessary steps to get that app to the cloud. So let's take a little look at a workflow that happens with AWS App Runner. The first thing that occurs if we set up App Runner in the AWS console is that we point it to the source of our app. So like I mentioned earlier, that can be a source code repository, like a GitHub URL, or a container image in Elastic Container Registry, for instance. After doing that and specifying your deployment settings, you can then configure the size of your instance. When the size meaning the CPU and memory of your container, as well as specify any auto-scaling or health check options you may have. The next thing App Runner needs is you'll need to review and create your service and deploy your source, and finally gives you a URL of your production rate instance of your app running in AWS App Runner. You also have the ability to use Copilot, which is a command line interface for AWS containers that bootstraps common tasks related to containers, and there is support for App Runner in Copilot. And if you're using .NET specifically, you can deploy your .NET app to AWS App Runner directly from the command line using the .NET Deploy Global tool that was created by AWS. So let's take a look at a quick demo of creating an API in .NET 6 and deploy it to AWS App Runner using the .NET Deploy Global CLI tool. All right, so here I am in Ubuntu in Windows Subsystem for Linux. I can validate that by just doing like uname-egg. And as you can see here, Windows Subsystem for Linux, and it's Ubuntu. So right now we're in the context of a Linux environment, but we're really running in Windows. So what I want to do real quick is I just want to create a .NET 6 application, and I want to containerize it with Docker, and then I want to deploy it to AWS App Runner. So let's go through a handful of steps here to be able to do that. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a new web project, and let's just specify the output of that as .NET on App Runner. Sorry for my typing. Okay, so this is just going to create a new application, a new project. So if I go in here, right, and then let's open up VS Code. One really cool thing about VS Code is that you can actually point it at a Windows Systems for Linux instance. So we can do new WSL window. Let's just get this other one out of the way. And then we can open up a folder. And inside that folder, I know that it's in the mount directory, it's in D, it's in dev, it's in the miscellaneous folder, and then I have a dotnet App Runner, right? So as you can see here, we'll wait for this to open up. Make sure our workspace loads, and as you can see, it's a simple minimal API .NET application. So I can actually, just to validate that everything is working the way I expect, I can .NET run here, and this is going to build and run my .NET 6 application, and I'm going to get this endpoint here. So I can pop up this open in a window. So let's just move that over. So as you can see, this is in the context of my Windows environment. So that's a really cool feature of WSL, is that it'll actually proxy over to your local environment. So that's a cool thing. But just to validate that this actually works in the context of my environment, I can actually spin up a new window. Whoops, not PowerShell. Ubuntu again. And I'm just going to curl that endpoint. So as you can see, pretty cool. There's my hello world, the first route of that. And we can validate that that is what we want, because as you can see, if anybody makes a request to the root of my API, of my app, they're going to get a hello world. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to containerize this particular project. So I can do that in Visual Studio Code. So I can just go Docker add Docker files to my workspace, and that's going to walk me through a wizard. So it's an ASP.NET Core. I want this to run Linux. The ports that I have, I can actually validate what those ports were on this one. So it's 7216 and 5227. So 7216, 5217, 5227, and 7216. Sorry, 7216. All right, so this is actually going to make sure that it has the C# extension, and that says, do you want to include Docker Compose? Say no. And this is just going to create a Docker ignore file and a Docker file. So as you can see, those are my ports, and pretty boilerplate .NET container image. So I can actually then hop back over to my console. Let's actually just build this that container and run it. So we can go Docker build, and then period for the current context, and then let's just go .NET App Runner. Oops, I need to specify that this is a tag, and then latest. Right. So this is going to go through. It's going to make sure that the Docker file is valid. It's going to build. It's going to publish, and it's going to make sure that everything's working the right way. So now we have a built Docker image. So let's actually take that Docker image and run it and create a container for it. So we go Docker run, and then specify the ports. And again, those ports that I want to use is 7216 and 5227. So let's just do 5227 just for grids. So 5227, 5227, and then we specify the .NET App Runner tag, and then that was the latest one, right? So what this will do, there you go. So we have a running Docker container. So let's see if this works. If I curl this again, let's just do 5227. So as you can see here again, so now I'm hitting the HTTP port, and I'm getting a hello world again. So we know that it's still running it. It's still running, so it's in Docker, right? So that's really, really cool. So now let's actually go one step further and deploy this application to AWS App Runner. So one really great thing, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is that we have an AWS deploy .NET Global tool. And what that basically does is it allows you to, from the command line, deploy an application to AWS. And we can actually take a look at .NET AWS, and then just go help. And we can list out some of the commands. So we have deploy, list deployments, can delete deployment, and so on and so forth. So let's just do that. So AWS, .NET AWS deploy. And what this will actually do, it'll check to see if we have the current AWS credentials. So I ran AWS configure earlier, and then it's going to start listing out options because it's an interactive tool. So we can deploy to ECS using AWS Fargate or Elastic Beanstalk on Linux or Windows, or just deploy the image, push the image to the container registry. Or in our case, we want to, oops, zoom in again. We wanted to deploy ASP.NET Core app to App Runner. So let's just specify option 2. So it would be let's just do option 2. And then we're going to specify a stack. Let's just call this .NET App Runner. And that's going to ask for what our options are be. So as you can see here, the port is 80. We actually don't want that port to be 80 because we have a 5227 port, and that's the port that our HTTP endpoint runs under. So let's actually change this port. So change it to 5227, validate that that's there, and then we're just going to execute it. So what this is actually going to do is it's going to again, it's going to build that container image. It's going to push that container image to Elastic Container Registry, and then it's going to call a CloudFormation stack to actually take that particular image and deploy it to AWS App Runner. And this will take a little bit of time, so let's fast forward to when it is complete. All right, so our deployment is complete, and as you can see, we have an endpoint that we can actually take a look at. So let's actually hit this endpoint, and I gotta move this over. And as you can see, we have our .NET application deployed to AWS App Runner, and we have our Hello World endpoint. So that's pretty cool. We can actually then manage this. We can actually open up, and this is the AWS Console, and we have App Runner. So let's just refresh this page and go to Services. And as you can see, we have our .NET App Runner servers running. We can actually click into here. We can take a look at the event logs that are running. We can look at different activity, and we can do different configuration and add custom domains and all that sort of stuff. We can also take a look at our image that's deployed to Elastic Container Registry. So we have this image here, and you can take a look at some of the information pertaining to that. So that's pretty cool. One also thing that's very, very interesting about the .NET deploy tool is that you don't need to have a Docker file that already exists. So let's just close this out, and let's go back into Visual Studio Code, and let's actually just delete. Let's just close this. Let's just delete the Docker file and the Docker ignore, right? So let's delete them. So now we don't have any Docker deployment tool at all, or any Docker files at all. So let's open this back up, and let's just run that same command. So what it'll do is it's going to scan our credentials again, and it's going to look at our existing deployments. And it sees that we've already deployed to .NET App Runner once. What I want to do is I want to actually specify a new deployment. So again, it's going to ask for different options, and we're going to choose option 4 in this case, which is ASP.NET Core to AWS App Runner. And it's going to specify a new deployment stack. So let's just call this .NET AR, just because it needs a different name. And it's the same thing. But since we are creating the Docker file by hand, we can actually don't need to specify the port in here. So we can leave that port the same. And what this is going to do, it's going to do very, very similar things earlier. So it's going to build a Docker file, but it's going to build a Docker file and push it to Elastic Container Registry. But if we go back over here, we see now that we have a Docker file. So this is a little bit different because there's a couple of additional things that have been added here that are different than the one that's created by Visual Studio Code. But the process is the same. So it's going to .NET build and .NET publish, and then it's going to add the entry point for that .NET on App Runner DLL. So if we hop back over to the command line, so again, this is doing all the same thing as earlier. So let's actually skip ahead to this one being complete. And now that this deployment is finished, we have the same output as earlier. So we have this endpoint. So let's open this endpoint up. I'll move this over. And again, same experience, right? So we have an AWS URL, and we have our hello world. So, there is one other thing that I think that would be really, really cool to check out. Let's actually make some updates to our application and deploy it out. So let's hop back over to Visual Studio Code. And I'm in my program.cs. And as you can see here, again, it's just a simple, there's one route. So let's actually add another route with a list of things. So what I want to be able to do is I want to have an endpoint called sports that basically returns a list of sports. So how I do that is I just do map get, and then I specify what I want that route to be. So in this case, I want it to be API sports. And then what I want to do is I'll follow the similar pattern as you see above. So it uses lambda notation. So, but what's different is that I want this, instead of to return one single string, I want to return a list of sports. So what I can do there is I can specify a list. And since I don't want to create a new class for this particular thing, let's just have it be a list of dynamic. That, and then choose that out. And then there you go. So at this point, it's going to return, in this point, it'll return an empty list, but let's actually start to add some in here. So let's just do new sport ID, and let's just say baseball, and then oops, sport name equals baseball, right? So nothing really crazy here, just specifying a handful of things. So let's just do this a few times. So let's have, instead of baseball, let's have basketball. Over, then we'll have soccer. If I can spell soccer, soccer, and then finally football, right? So nothing really crazy here. So when someone hits the API sports endpoint, they're going to get a list of sports. So let's go back into the deployment tool. Let's close all that, and then let's just run that same .NET AWS deploy command as well. It's going to list two different deployment stacks that we've done. So it would be .NET AR, because that's the second one that we did. And again, specifying the port 80 and all the CPU and memory information, and we'll just do this again. So again, same process as earlier. It's going to build that container image. It's going to push that container image to Elastic Container Registry, and then it's going to update our App Runner instance or App Runner service. So let's fast forward to when that's done. All right, and again, our deployment is complete, and we have this endpoint. And as you can see, there's some updates that occurred if you look at some of the CDK logs. We can actually pop this open, so let's bring this over here. And again, still the same endpoint, but if we change this to sports, look at that. So as you can see, we have those sports that we talked about earlier. So that's pretty exciting. So let's actually do one more thing that we can, just to show some of the cool things that you can do in App Runner itself. So let's hop over to the .NET AR service that we created. And as you can see here, we have some logs, and we have some metrics, and we can take a look at, for instance, the number of HTTP requests that have come through. We can also look at active instances. So what I want to be able to do is I want to change the configuration of my AWS App Runner instance to Autoscale. So how I do that is I can scroll down here in the configuration section to my Autoscale area. So what I want to do is I want to edit it. So let's scroll down. Let's save these changes here. Sorry, I clicked the wrong one. We want to edit our services. So let's go to auto scaling, and we have a default configuration, but we can actually create a new one. So in this case, I'm just going to go test scaling. And then for concurrent requests, so basically the requests that per instance before autoscaling kicks in, let's actually drop this number to like 5. Right? And we have the same other numbers for the other thing. So the minimum size is 1, and let's just do maximum size. Let's just have this be like 10. Let's add this one, right? And scroll down and save our changes. So now if we go down and we take a look, so now we have our concurrency is 5. So when we scale, or we're gonna test this, it's going to start with 1, and it's going to go all the way up to 10. So let's wait for this to update, and then once it updates, we can use some Hey, which is a performance testing tool, to be able to validate that these things are working. All right, so now that our .NET AR service is now updated, let's actually test this. So let's take a look. Let's open this back up, and again, we want to hit that API sports endpoint, just make sure this is still working. Okay, cool. So what I want to be able to do, and let's drill in here, we can actually take a look at some of our metrics, and let's scroll down, and we want to actually watch the active instances. Enlarge. Okay, so now what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to track how many instances happen when, or we want to watch the active instances scale up as more requests come in. So what I want to be able to do is I'm going to use the Hey tool to be able to kind of run some tests here. And how I do that is I just go Hey, and I specify the interval that I want for my requests, and then I specify the amount of concurrent requests, and then I just specify that endpoint. So we'll click that. So that's running. So let's hop over back to AWS App Runner, and this is going to start to scale up. Let's wait for this to happen. And if I refresh this here, it'll actually see like, look, it's scaled up to 4 instances, which is pretty cool. So that's, we can watch the auto scaling take into effect. So if we go back to Hey here, we can see that it ran for 60 seconds and it made a ton of requests. So we can actually look at the latency distribution. We can actually see how many requests it was actually submitted. So if we go back to the AWS console here, we can actually see that there were over 40,000 individual requests to that endpoint in that span, and that triggered that scale up. So that's just one of the things that come out of the box really, really great with App Runner is the ability to just configure scaling really, really simply. And there you have it. Really cool story about how we can deploy .NET applications to AWS Runner. And if you're liking the content here, be sure to like, subscribe, and share along. And let me know if there's other AWS with .NET specific content you want to see. I'd love to hear from you. So that's it for me today. This is Isaac Levin, AWS for .NET developer. Take care.